I was listening to a radio show calling people to the Catholic Church, and here's how they described our history.
Christianity has been devastating to the Jews through history, that the record of Christian civilization was quite poor, with the deliberate permission and sometimes instigation of the Holy See itself. Catholics have done atrocious things to Jews in history, deprived them of civil rights and sometimes even of their own children. Absolutely horrific. And the only proper response to those kinds of atrocities is repentance, to apologize for the sins of Catholics against Jews.
Who, I wondered, would want to commune with that? To fill in some details, I turned to an article. It looked official enough. It was written by a priest. We'll look at this article in detail, and in it we'll find the same terms: strife, cruelty, expulsion, slavery, persecution, infringed civil rights, suffering, massacres, hatred, violence, 2 millennia of evil. Written, again, by a priest. From the summary we read, was there a direct line from the New Testament to the gas chambers at Auschwitz? Probably not. Well, that's a relief. Matthew and Mark, you guys are probably off the hook for now, because the Church Fathers were the far greater culprit. Really? For something that happened 15 centuries later? Because they gave the continuing rationale for the indefensible Christian conduct of the Middle Ages onward that was xenophobic and angry. Because of the church, anti-Semitism was born. But then I remembered some history, how the first thing the Nazis did after invading Poland was to round up all the priests and the intellectuals. They had to do that before they started the camps, and I wondered why. From what I'd been hearing, these priests would have been cheering them on. But it was the exact opposite. Of course, the Pope condemned the racist nationalism of the Third Reich as idolatry, as aggressive paganism. But still, the article asks, were the baptized Christians of Europe ripe for pagan nationalism? How can baptism make you ripe for paganism? It's the opposite. So we'll turn to a church document, an official document released under John Paul II, and we read, the Shoah was the work of a thoroughly modern neo-pagan regime, a regime that also oppressed and persecuted the church. But it may be asked whether the Nazi persecution of the Jews was not made easier by the anti-Jewish prejudices embedded in some Christian minds and hearts. They sound parallel, but these are very, very different questions. One suggests that baptism prepares the continent and the soul for evil. The other acknowledges that evil exists despite the church's efforts. We will return to the Vatican document later, but first it's a question of authentic interpretation of Mosaic law. Is that to be found in the church or in the synagogue? Most Jews, we read, could hear the Christian claims with amusement, and in the early days without any violent reaction. Other reactions were violent. You can ask Stephen, James, and Peter about that. Next, the New Testament writings of Paul and John feature bitter internal Jewish argumentation. Well, that's one way to put it, and this is probably Exhibit 1A from the New Testament, but it is in there. You can look it up. And at this point, both sides shared the same ethnicity. Within a century, however, that changed. And the author in this article focuses on ethnicity. Okay, that's his view, but do we find that view in the Church Fathers? Well, let's see. In 380, Theodosius I decreed Christianity to be the official state religion. Here is a short timeline of 4th century church history, and the Christian population now outnumbered the Jewish population. Circumstances did not bode well for Judaism or for any other religion other than Christianity. Well, that's a negative way to put it. The popularly elected Ambrose, a bishop, opposed the efforts of Theodosius to acknowledge the civil rights of Jews, pagans, and heretics as equal to those of Christians. Christians, again, who were practicing the official state religion. And then here it is, alleged hate speech from a church father, taken, of course, out of context. So what is that context? Ambrose is in Milan. 2,000 miles away, a synagogue is burned down by a mob of Christians. Ambrose did not call for this to happen. He does not call for it to be repeated. The question is, what will happen next? The emperor wants to force the local bishop to rebuild the synagogue. Sounds like it could be a good idea, but Ambrose is against it, and he argues against it. Let's see why. In his letter, Ambrose cites numerous examples of recent Jewish mobs burning down churches. This happened especially during the reign of Julian the Apostate. They did this without punishment. Ambrose also reminds the emperor that, quote, at Constantinople, the bishop's house was burnt and your own son interceded against retaliation. Now the quote in context. Who will avenge the synagogue? It's tough language next, but the same stuff you read in St. Paul. Who is to avenge the Valentinians? The who? The Valentinians, a Gnostic sect, heretical Christians. The emperor denied them, the Valentinians, permission to meet together. Outlawing the Gnostics, that reminds Ambrose of what Gideon and good King Josiah did in the Old Testament. They protected right worship, but Theodosius is not convinced. And maybe you're not convinced either. If the bishop is not punished, people will get the message that it's okay to burn down synagogues. That's a valid point. And if you think somebody needs to be punished, Ambrose has a suggestion. You should kill the bishop, turn him into a martyr. Ambrose even offers to take the bishop's place. More context now. The Western Roman Empire is about to fall apart. The bishop and the emperor square off. Literally, they square off face to face over the question of authority. Ambrose, as bishop, can admit or refuse communion to the emperor. But what power does an emperor have over a bishop? That's a question. Can an emperor force a bishop to build a synagogue? Would that be a religious act? It's a question. And the issue you might have noticed of church-state relations, it hasn't ever gone away. One more thing. Theodosius, he liked peace and he liked order. He liked these things so much that 2 years later he massacred 7,000 people in Thessalonica. These victims certainly included descendants of those converts by Paul 3 centuries earlier. Our main article moves ahead here and we'll catch back up to it. But first, I wanted to learn more or read more about these church fathers, so I turned to this website. These same quotes are found on other websites. And again, these are the quotes that are designed to make the church fathers look bad. Let us see what they say. Ignatius of Antioch. Not a great translation here. This one makes more sense. It is absurd to profess Jesus Christ and to Judaize. To Judaize means to insist on circumcision and following dietary laws, to insist on those things, etc. For Christianity did not embrace Judaism, but Judaism, Christianity. And that's the history of the early church. The first generation of Christians were Jews who were baptized and converted. Is that anti-Semitic to say that? The Epistle of Barnabas mentions how the Mosaic covenant was, quote, lost. But if you look at that quote in context, it is an interpretation of Exodus 32 and Deuteronomy chapter 9. Everyone agrees that the physical stone tablets were broken by Moses. Now, exactly what the significance of that is, it's an open theological question. You'd imagine it to be brought up by religious texts, and we'll see that same thing again later. The same facts, the same data, different interpretations, fighting over the interpretation. But who are these people? Who are these people who, quote, pile up sin? That does not describe Jewish people. It describes Christians in this epistle, Christians who Judaize, who think that salvation is achieved through Torah observance, or at least partially through Torah observance. They say with their actions, they show that Christ's sacrifice was neither necessary nor sufficient. Oh, I see. Well, maybe that explains why Ambrose was so concerned about having a bishop directly involved in rebuilding a synagogue. Justin Martyr is talking specifically about Jews and their afflictions, the afflictions that they have suffered. He's talking about past afflictions, though. He is not advocating for new ones. And that your land may be desolate, that your cities burned with fire, and strangers may eat your fruit in your presence, and not one of you may go up to Jerusalem. Well, where did Justin come up with that? Well, it's from Isaiah 1:7. And when we find it in context, more Old Testament quotes. Turns out, I guess if you're really looking for the source of anti-Semitism, it's not in the Fathers, it's not in the New Testament. You have to go back to the Old Testament for it. But let's look closer. This is a specific Christian reading of the Old Testament. Christians know that God chastises out of mercy. He never stops calling a people to himself. That's the Christian view when we read the prophets, when we read in the prophets about lawless children, children of the whore who will be cut off into the land of the enemies. Draw near to me. That's what we read. We don't miss that point. Draw near to me, says the text, and says Justin Martyr. God scatters and then regathers into something even greater. Exile is a constant Old Testament theme. Justin here suggests that the destruction of the temple in 70 AD should be interpreted as part of that same story. Origen of Alexandria writes on the same theme. Now, the argument here is that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD because Jesus was rejected. There's context, though, and it is again relevant here. We're reading a debate between Origen and Celsus. Celsus opposes both Christianity and Judaism. He is a Platonist. Celsus mocks both sides for caring about history. Here is how he describes both Jews and Christians: as a flight of bats, a swarm of ants, frogs holding council in a marsh, worms crawling together in a dunghill, quarreling. Again, that's what we sound like to Celsus while we argue about insignificant things like cities. This Platonist can't understand, can't imagine why an almighty God would care about a silly thing like a city. And Origen responds that history matters. It's real data. The historical fact of the Roman destruction of the temple, it's significant. For Jews, it is one of perhaps the most significant event in all history. And Origen is not celebrating what happened or saying it should be repeated everywhere else. He is defending. What is he defending? He's defending the rationality of revealed religion. Neither Origen nor Justin Martyr invented this idea, the idea that 70 AD was connected to 33 AD. Nobody needed these guys to write about that to make that connection in the first century. And you are free to disagree with that conclusion if you want to, but I need to point out that today everybody agrees that Origen was right. History does matter. That's why we're having this discussion here. And next, St. John Chrysostom, the synagogue is worse than a brothel, etc., etc. And seen in context, it is again, you guessed it, an interpretation of Old Testament prophecy, this time from Jeremiah. And see this ellipses here? You see that ellipses here? What do you think it replaced? It replaces, quote, Jeremiah said. That's questionable use of ellipses in my opinion. Let us now rephrase John Chrysostom. The same call to communion that Jeremiah gave to King Zedekiah 1,000 years ago, I now repeat to you today: hold fast to the true faith. But next we have the big H word. I hate the synagogue. I hate the Jews. So that sounds bad. In context, we read, this is the reason I hate the synagogue, because they read the sacred writings but reject their witness. In other words, the Old Testament, according to St. John Chrysostom, the Old Testament should be a great invitation to faith, but it can be misused as a barrier to true faith in the Christian religion. And this is why I hate the Jews. Although they possess the law, they put it to outrageous use. For it is by means of the law that they try to entice and catch simple-minded men. In other words, don't be a Judaizer. Beware the Judaizers, says St. John Chrysostom. And the full title of this work tells us that it is a discourse delivered against those who were Judaizing. And at the beginning of his homilies, these are 8 homilies, and at the very beginning, John sets the scene. A pious Christian woman is being dragged into a synagogue. She objects. John intervenes and asks her abductor, "Are you a Christian?" "Yes, I am." "Well, then what are you doing?" The man explains, quote, "Many people had told him that oaths sworn at the synagogue are more to be feared." I'm just trying to get some fearful oaths from the synagogue. I heard that's where you go to get things like that. Again, John Chrysostom is writing to Christians about Christians. And John's message, don't look for authority or authenticity at the synagogue. Look to Christ. And since you'll hear John Chrysostom cited as an especially bad offender in this category, let us consider another source, the Baltimore Sun newspaper. This one is offensive, and not just the typo in the headline. "Although such beasts are unfit for work, they are fit for killing. And this is what happened to the Jews. While they were making themselves unfit for work, they grew fit for slaughter." Yikes. But in context, it is, again, a commentary on the Old Testament. Where did all that abusive language come from? Well, from Moses, Hosea, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. Now, we know why the journalist at the Baltimore Sun chose this quote, because it sounds nasty. But why did John quote Moses? And why did he choose Deuteronomy 32? That's the Song of Moses. It's near the end of the Pentateuch. And here Moses reflects on 40 years in the wilderness. It was a time of closeness with God, but also a time of rebellion. Israel was God's special possession. He spread his wings to take them up and nourished them with honey from the rock. But Israel soon became fat and unruly. The people grew heavy, plump, and stuffed. Then they abandoned the God who had made them. They made light of the rock of their salvation. You neglected the rock who has fathered you. You forgot the God who had given you birth. The Lord saw this and drew back. They abandoned God, and then the Lord saw this and drew back and said, I will abandon them. But that, of course, is not the end of the story. God calls his people back. I am the one who wounds and heals. So why quote Moses? Because the Judaizing Christian pointed to that special closeness with God in the Old Testament. Okay, John agrees. But Moses himself warned that closeness can lead to complacency. It can lead to blindness and spiritual drunkenness, and yet God still calls us. Why does John quote Isaiah? I didn't choose this fast, says the Lord. We find the same idea in Isaiah chapter 1, where he tells King Uzziah that your sacrifices literally stink. Why quote Isaiah? Because the Judaizing Christian says that God himself established these festivals. John agrees, but Isaiah made clear that such things are not pleasing to God without faith, without obedience, justice, and concern for the poor, and yet God still calls us. Look past his extreme language, and you will find John making a subtle point, one firmly rooted in the Old Testament. And there's one more quote that the newspaper avoids here. Quote, those enemies who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. Well, that's even worse. Why didn't they include that? Well, because it came out of the mouth of Jesus, as quoted in the Gospel according to Luke. This is from the end of the parable of the talents. You could imagine people reading that quote and saying, oh, well, we got to throw that in. That makes John look bad. And then figuring out where it came from and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't put this in. But that's why they didn't quote that there, because it's from the Gospel. It's from the end of a parable. Emphasis on parable. No honest reading would conclude that Jesus or Moses or Isaiah or John Chrysostom, any of them, were calling for or condoning violence. And one more thing. Let us try again to look at this situation from the point of view of the Judaizing Christian. The man seems to have a point. The synagogue is older, bigger, wealthier than the local church. It's been recognized by the Roman government longer, and its members are, well, smarter than the Christians. They can read the Old Testament in the original Hebrew. Why not stop by for a prayer? Why not stop by to make an oath? Why not take part in their fall and springtime festivals? Well, John responds, because we look to Christ. Yes, the Old Testament texts are good. They're good because they point to Christ, but that is not the interpretation given at the synagogue. It's what Christians believe, but it's not what they're teaching there. Those texts point to a God who, as we run away from him, runs even faster after us, who loved us to the end, who suffered to draw the entire world to himself. And we have one more here from St. Augustine. How hateful to me are the enemies of your scripture. How I wish that you would slay them, the Jews, with your two-edged sword. Well, the only bad thing about this is the translation, because the word Jew or Jewish, it does not appear anywhere, not once in the entire 12th book of the Confessions. The, quote, them being referred to here, that refers to people who disagree with Augustine on the interpretation of Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. As another Platonist, this time a Christian Platonist, but Augustine interprets the heavens as, quote, the intellectual heaven, where to understand is to know all at once. Let us pause to summarize what the Church Fathers were and were not doing. They were not writing to Jews. Dear so-and-so, you stink. No, that's not it at all. They were writing to Christians, defining the faith. And they were not writing about Jews either, but about the errors of Judaizing Christians, writing to Christians about Christians. They were not advocating violence, although persecutions were a shared reality at that time. And they were not calling for Judaism to be wiped out. They were, however, arguing that the Old Testament texts must be interpreted in a Christian way that some Jews found objectionable. Next, we move forward in history, peaceful coexistence and papal intervention. Sounds like the popes are intervening with the peace. There is no popular writing extant to tell us how ordinary Christians thought of Jews and acted towards them for 600 years. It must have fixed in the popular mind, the conviction that the Jews had crucified Jesus and that their descendants bore hereditary guilt for the deed because they had never repudiated it. That's our author here. That wasn't any of the church fathers, and that is an oddly precise thing that, quote, must have been fixed in the popular mind given the complete lack of evidence. A fair presumption is that Jews and Christians got on fairly peacefully. Pagan idolatry was the common enemy. Is it just me, or does every sentence contradict the one before it? The correspondence of Gregory I tells us something about attempts at forced conversion, and what it tells us is that forced conversions were condemned. Quoting the Pope, it is necessary to gather those who are at odds with the Christian religion by meekness and kindness, lest they be repelled by threats. The papal correspondence was, by and large, protective of Jewish rights, while continuing to assume their subordinate position in society. A century later, the expulsion of the Jews was beginning in Europe from France under King Dagobert, 626. Let's look him up. Dagobert concluded a treaty with the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, which entailed compulsory baptism of Jews. Well, that makes it sound like it was Heraclius' idea. Who was he? An emperor in Constantinople, and in 613 the Persian army took Damascus with the help of the Jews and seized Jerusalem. Well, that would get your attention. We read on, Heraclius is one of the few Byzantine emperors to have had an imperial conversion campaign. The rarity of such campaigns is thought to be due to Christian theology, which rejected forced conversion. Not exactly the impression our author gave. We continue. Under the Spanish monarchy with church collusion in 694, the Jews were required to choose between baptism and slavery. Another newspaper article. The 17th Council of Toledo and a conspiracy theory. Jews of both continents were preparing to make common cause with the Muslims to conquer Iberia. Looking then at the council documents, Canon 8 does mention a plot by Jews and Muslims to conquer Spain. The council does prescribe punishments, but only for those who have received baptism, and that is not a minor point. The council responded to a rebellion among the baptized. That's the group it has authority to talk about and to. What happened next? Well, by coincidence, there was the Umayyad conquest of Hispaniola and a golden age of Jewish culture, where we read, it is possible that Jews welcomed the Muslim conquerors in the 8th century. These moves appear to be based on religion, but history has shown that all such expulsions and persecutions are dependent on other factors such as politics, xenophobia, and scapegoating. Or sometimes they're based on Muslim invasions. And those were the two examples that our author chose. We're just following his lead here and doing a little internet searching. The unique factor was that the Christians arrived early at the erroneous conclusion that the Jews were being divinely punished for not having come over to their way of belief, even when religious difference had little or nothing to do with specific Christian antagonism to Jews. It could always be alleged as the root rationale for Christian behavior. It could be alleged. Well, lots of things could be alleged. Next, he says, the papal record is consistently mixed. Harsh infringements are censured, even as harsh language continues. But things are nowhere near as bad as they will get in the 20th century. Okay, let's look at that mixed papal record at Gregory X from 1272. Since it happens occasionally that some Christians lose their children and Jews are accused by their enemy of secretly carrying off and killing these same Christian children. Oh no. This is called the blood libel. What will the Pope have to say about it? Well, he says it's a completely false claim, one that is used to extort money. It's absurd. Jewish law forbids Jews sacrificing, eating, or drinking blood. This has been demonstrated many times at our court by converted Jews. We decree, therefore, that Christians need not be listened to when they bring suit against Jews in situations of this type, and we order that Jews seized under such a silly pretext be freed from imprisonment. Part of the Pope's mixed record. The medieval era, Jews of Western Europe began to suffer new indignities as the Crusades came on. Let's look it up, because violence, of course, did happen. And in response, the bishops of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms protected Jews within the walls of their palaces. Afterwards, there was a continued effort made by the popes to protect the Jews so that the same violence that occurred in the Rhineland Valley would not reoccur. When St. Bernard of Clairvaux was urging recruitment for the Second Crusade, he specifically criticized the attacks on Jews that had occurred in the First Crusade. Yes, violence happened. Yes, that's bad. That's not the question. The question is, again, it's whether this violence happens because of or in spite of the church's teaching. Speaking of which, the Sicut Judaeus was issued around this time to clarify the position of the church on how Jews should be treated. And we'll get there in just a second. But first, it's a bit off topic, but what about the Albigensian Crusade against Christian heretics in southern France? The Pope was at the same time protecting Jews in Germany and massacring Christian heretics in France. I bring this up just to highlight one fact. None of this was based on race or ethnicity. Jews were treated worse than Catholics, but better than heretics. They were welcomed as converts. Nothing on here was about this, with nothing based on race. And getting back to Sicut Judaeus, no prejudice or persecution, no forced baptism, property rights, the right to their own religious festivals, protection of their cemeteries. Christians who violated these laws were to be excommunicated. Still, many German Jews fled eastward. Several Polish noblemen of the Middle Ages showed special favor to Jews, and another golden age, a high point of Jewish intellectual life in Europe, a fact that made what happened next even more tragic. Skimming past the Reformation, we are back to the summary, and visitors to the museum who say, "Why has no one told us these things?" Well, it may take centuries of education and prayer to reverse the evils of 2 millennia. The Christian communions have at least made a start. Well, I agree that truth matters. I disagree, though, that church history can truthfully be described as 2 millennia of evil. For a better approach, let us turn back to that Vatican document now. We remember. It's written as a type of collective examination of conscience at the end of the 20th century, the bloodiest in history. To place ourselves humbly before the Lord and examine ourselves against the responsibility which we too have for the evils of our time, to heal the wounds of past misunderstandings, and to become more fully conscious of the sinfulness of the children of the Church, who make of themselves a counter-witness and a scandal. Because as members of the Church we are linked to the sins as well as to the merits of all her children. And what I found objectionable in Father Sloyan's article, the lack of humility. He condemns these saints, these fathers, as anti-Semitic. He'd probably like to see them excommunicated, at least he sounds like he does. And I'm not being defensive here. You said something negative about someone on my team, so now I have to retaliate. No, it's not that. Instead, I notice that prejudice against the church fathers can become a new type of scapegoating. And this type of scapegoating can be especially tempting to those who see Vatican II as a huge break from tradition, just call everything in the past bad and condemn it, but claiming that all our history is evil and that we need centuries of re-education. Claims like that don't do any good. Claims like that do not change hearts. They do not heal wounds. They do the opposite because they transform a moment of self-examination into a political weapon, boasting about our eagerness and willingness to criticize our fathers, to prove what? I'm not sure what you're trying to prove here, that you're open-minded. Back to the Vatican document. Here we do find a spirit of reconciliation and reciprocity, balance, and it's an attempt to unite around shared principles. So the document calls for an end to anti-Judaism among Christians and anti-Christian sentiment among Jews. Another trip now through that same history. The Church's relationship to the Jewish people is unlike the one she shares with other religions. St. Ambrose might have remembered that. After the crucifixion of Jesus, the Jewish leaders violently opposed the first Christians. At this time, Jews were legally protected by privileges granted by the emperor and the authorities. Christians incurred the persecution of the state. Later, when the emperors themselves converted to Christianity, they at first continued to guarantee Jewish privileges, but Christian mobs who attacked pagan temples sometimes did the same to synagogues. It was a painful separation, not a list of crimes like we heard from the radio broadcast, but a painful separation. And that broadcast also missed a crucial distinction between the actions of the baptized and the teachings of the hierarchy. In the Christian world, I do not say on the part of the church as such, but in the Christian world there were erroneous and unjust interpretations of the New Testaments regarding the Jewish people. These misinterpretations led to hostility. But the hierarchy was the one and only institution that survived to resolve misinterpretations on Scripture. It's customary to mention here Nostra Aetate, but we already saw how 600 years earlier with Gregory X and 600 years before him with Gregory I, this correction of the record was already at play. This Vatican document is challenging. It's challenging to faithful Catholics specifically because it is so fair. For example, it mentions other causes of the anti-Jewish feelings in the 19th and 20th centuries, including the perceived influence of that group and heightened nationalism in Germany after its defeat in 1918. It mentions how the church preached against Nazism and how, after Kristallnacht, the provost of the Berlin Cathedral offered public prayers for the Jews. He later died at Dachau. Pius XII warned against denying the unity of the human race, and the deification of the state, because Catholicism was and is the intellectual enemy of racist nationalism. And after the war, the Pope was recognized and thanked by Jewish leaders and communities for what he did to save hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. In conclusion, the Shoah was the work of a thoroughly modern neo-pagan regime. Its anti-Semitism had roots outside Christianity, and it is only after stating that conclusion that we look inside and ask whether the Nazi persecution of the Jews was not made easier by the anti-Jewish prejudices embedded in some Christian minds and hearts. Did anti-Jewish sentiment among Christians make them less sensitive or even indifferent to the persecution launched against the Jews by National Socialism when it reached power? See the difference? Loyal Christians here are not being accused of bringing evil into the world from the church. No, the question is, do we do enough to stop it? And in fairness, the document points out that many Christians, many thousands in Nazi-occupied lands, risked their own lives to save their Jewish neighbors, while Western countries, including America, refused to open its borders to the persecuted. The document does not forget either other 20th century victims. We recall in particular the massacre of the Armenians, the countless victims in Ukraine in the 1930s. The genocide of the Gypsies, which was also based on racist ideas, and similar tragedies which have occurred in America, Africa, and the Balkans. Nor do we forget the millions of victims of totalitarian ideology in the Soviet Union, in China, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Nor can we forget the drama of the Middle East, the elements of which are well known. Even as we make this reflection, many human beings are still their brothers' victims. Did you catch that? The document made a not so subtle reference to the Palestinian conflict. Now, why? Why would this document do that? Because we remember the Palestinians and their suffering. To remember is to have an identity. To forget, to deny, or to demonize your past, that is to lose your identity and to accept as a replacement an identity imposed on you by someone else, someone who can then define your enemies, or who can define you as an enemy, all to keep us divided. And yet God still gathers his people to himself.